Hey everybody, it's Grandmaster Ben Feingold. It's Wednesday, May 12th, 2021. This is our first class ever where we have a live audience and we have an internet audience. Frankly, terrible. We want to thank our sponsor, Olivier Bousquet, the famous poker player. Not a bad chess player either. In fact, I've been told he's not as bad as he plays. And he's sponsored this lecture and the next one. This lecture is on the French defense Tarrasch variation. And I didn't want to do it from anybody's point of view because then it would be subjective. And even though objectivity is subjective, I still want to be objective. Right, Ovi? Yeah. Did you see that movie? No. Oh, terrible. Didn't see Love and Death? Horrible. Okay. Anyway, so this lecture is going to be pretty simple. I was going to make it super complicated, but then Ovi showed up. Okay, so let's start. This is a pawn. This is a bishop. Okay, so the French defense is named so because there was a telex or some kind of thing we don't use anymore between London and Paris before you were born. That's not a joke. I'm not making that up. And it was like in the 1800s, and then Paris played e6. Okay. And it's not the most aggressive move, but then again, Parisians aren't known for being aggressive. So, okay, now the point of e6, you have to understand when your opponent plays e4, if you don't do anything, he's going to grab the center. So there's two ways to prevent d4, c5 and e5, which don't really prevent d4, but they make it less good. So some people play c5 and e5, very common moves. And some people want to play d5 themselves. Now we have people who probably belong in institutions like John Bartholomew, and he'll play d5 right now. The Scandinavian and or the center counter. Frankly, ridiculous. When I was 9 years old, my favorite age, I was at Montreal 1979. Okay, it was one of the first super tournaments. And we lived in Detroit, and my dad drove my family up to Montreal. And we were there when Larson beat Karpov with the black pieces playing d5. I saw it. And still Karpov and Tal tied for first. Most people don't want to play d5 and let white take it, so they prepare d5 with either c6 or e6, the Caro-Kann and the French. Now the problem with c6 is if you play c5, then you're losing a tempo. Problem with e6 is this bishop has some issues. Okay, on the other hand, this bishop gets out quicker. This doesn't help any of your minor pieces. Okay, so e6, and the sponsor of the lecture wanted to do a very specific move in this position. And at the top level, grandmasters play knight c3 or knight d2 or e5. Okay, in the Feingold family, what's the most famous game that starts knight c3? If you're watching live, you can answer. If you're watching on the internet, you can unmute and say the game. Remember, it's the Feingold family. Right, Karen is correct. Also, probably somebody was trying to answer. I didn't hear him. Right, Bobby Fischer versus my dad, Ron Feingold, 1963. And at the lower levels, e takes d5 is quite common. And I think I'm in the lower level because I like e takes d5. Okay, now, the Tarrasch variation is the subject of the lecture, but this is like from Family Guy when it's a 6-second, podcast, so bye. All right, now, I thought it dragged a little. Now, knight d2 has the obvious idea of defending the e4 pawn. And you may be wondering, why do you play knight d2 instead of knight c3? After knight c3, black can play bishop b4, pinning the knight. And there's another reason that's more complicated. So, could somebody give Ovi a ball? Okay, because all right. That reason is, in many variations, white plays e5. We'll see that. And if white plays e5 ever, usually white wants to play c3 and back up that center. If the knight's on c3, that's harder to do. Okay, and the obvious bad point of knight d2 is it blocks the bishop and it undefends this pawn. So there's good and there's bad, but is there ugly? Okay. Now, in this position, grandmasters have played every move except bishop a3. So we don't pin the knight anymore because of c3. Now, if you know every opening perfectly, like most of you do, especially those watching at home on YouTube, this idea of knight d2 versus knight c3 for avoiding a pin reminds me obviously of the Grunfeld, right, Ovi? Okay, in the main line of the Grunfeld, which is you take on d5, you play e4, and you get this position. Okay, white has two ways to play with his knight on g1. The knight can go here or here. And they're both very popular, but you don't play knight here blocking the bishop, you play bishop c4. Then you play knight here. Then if the bishop ever pins the knight, we unpin. Happens all the time. Or you could play knight f3, which looks more logical, but then you can get pinned later, and you do. Okay, so grandmasters aren't in agreement as to which one's better. They play them both. Okay, so knights on f3 or c3 it can get pinned. If it's on d2 or e2, it's not as active, but it's not going to get pinned. Okay, so a lot of openings have the same ideas. All right. Now, in this position, the most common moves are clearly knight f6 and c5. I actually don't know which one is more common, but I know in the 1970s, c5 was more common, as was played often in which world championship match? I could say matches. Anybody there? Anybody? Anybody know in the chat? No? Any of you guys know? 1970s World Championship? That was in the 70s, yeah. I can't hear anybody if you're answering, so I don't know. Yeah, speak up, speak louder. Speak up, I can't hear you. Man, how come I can't hear you? Man. Maybe it's set when John talks not to hear him.
How about this? Is that better?
Yeah.
If I put my microphone on. How about Korchnoi versus Karpov?
Right. Karpov white against Korchnoi, there was a lot of c5. I mean, a lot of c5. Now, in the 70s, when you took this pawn, which was common, people took with the pawn. And this is what I played, because I played the French between the ages of like 5 and 18. And then I started playing other stuff. And I played this way because that's what Korchnoi did. And so I'm like, yeah, Korchnoi is pretty good. But I also played another way in this position, which I'll talk about. However, also common is queen takes d5. And if I was a betting man, I would say that's been more common for the last 15 years. But in the 70s and early 80s, it wasn't. But now it is. And obviously, black doesn't get the isolated pawn, but black is moving his queen out. As my dad would say, both sides stand badly. Like, this queen's going to get harassed. Why is this knight blocking the bishop? Why is this pawn hanging? So, both sides are playing crazy. Okay. Now, let's start with the least common move of the moves I'm going to show you, which is knight c6. And as I've said many times on my stream and Karen's stream, and when I'm sleeping and when I was in outer space with Homer, this is called the Guillemard variation, named after Carlos Guillemard. It's similar to the Chigorin because you're playing d5, knight c6. Now here you're directly threatening this pawn, and it may surprise you. Knight f3 is the main move. That won't surprise you. If you play c3, one interesting move for black is e5, confusing the audience. And then, I think this is about equal, actually. But super grandmasters usually play knight gf3, and then knight f6, and you get this position. And this position, again, both sides did something they didn't want to do. Black doesn't want his knight here. Black would like to play c5 through his knight. And white doesn't want his knight here because the bishop can't get out. And black has two ideas. He's going to play c5 at some point, or he's going to play f6, and that pawn's attacked a lot. And so, for example, if bishop d3, you could play knight b4, and then if he goes back, you could play c5. And if bishop e2, to prevent all of that, now you play f6. f6 is indefensible. So you have to take, and the point is you take with the queen, you play bishop d6, and you try to play e5. And then, your pieces are going to explode, but not on c4. Okay. And I've had black in these positions many times. When I was a tween or a teen, I had black in these positions. And once in the US Championship in Tulsa, I think 2007, I also had black in this position. And I got a big advantage, and then I drew, and then I choked on my own rage. So knight c6 attacks this pawn and puts white on the defensive temporarily. It's not a very common move. Now, this is hard to explain, but that's probably more my fault than anybody else's. In this position, and this is going to sound crazy to you, a lot of people think white is in Zugzwang. Now I'm going to explain why. And then I'm going to explain why these moves that make no sense then make sense. A very common move is knight f6. And Karen's like, yeah, I play that all the time. And after e5 knight here, white has a couple ways of playing. White can just develop his pieces, like, knight f3 and bishop d3 and so forth. Or white can play f4 and try to build a big center. And if white doesn't play f4 ever, a lot of people think c5, knight c6, the center is going to crumble. And a lot of the main lines are white sacrificing a pawn, as in every game that you've played against, what, Grandmaster Gus? Yeah, okay. So for example, what's that? Yeah. So like this is a very common variation where white sacrifices a pawn, and this is the main line. Obviously, if you're a super grandmaster, you could play queen c5, and if white plays queen a4, you can repeat draw. Very suspicious. I think knight c5 is the best move, but I'm not 100% sure. And white has compensation for a pawn, and black's up a pawn, and it's a passed pawn. So that's for you to decide. Lots of grandmaster games. And in these openings, as I showed today in Arena Kings, if you watched my Arena Kings, if you're white, you got to be willing to sacrifice a pawn, which I'm not willing to do, but in 1 minute and 3 minutes, then I am willing to do it. But, in a slow game, I like my pawns. So that's not everybody's cup of tea, but some people. What were you saying, Olivier?
Can you just articulate what white's compensation is in the position?
Sure. So white has lots of compensation. One is white castled and black isn't castling soon. One is I have two pieces out to one. The other is my bishop can go anywhere it wants. This bishop, and white can easily get a kingside attack by swinging his queen over here, and then the truth might hurt. And a lot of people, the way they were brought up in chess, when they were beginners, then they got better, they still do the beginner stuff they were taught because that's what they do. And some beginners are like, I want to sack all my pieces and checkmate my opponent. And some beginners, probably more, want to never, ever, ever lose anything. Losing stuff is bad. So they would never sacrifice anything because then their coach would say, you're down a knight, you're down a pawn, what are you doing? Okay. And so, and here the compensation is relatively obvious because this is pinned, this is in the center, this e5 pawn is annoying for black, there's a lot of space, this queen can get harassed, bishop e3 for example, and there's sort of a ready-made kingside attack. So that's why every move black is trying to trade queens, okay, like queen b4 and maybe queen c5, because Olivier's correct. If we trade queens and Olivier said, where's white's compensation? I would say, well, it doesn't really have much. But with queens on the board, Black's king is going to have a tough time being safe. And if Black's going to win the game by getting the position itself to be okay, and then say, haha, I have an extra pawn. I mean, I'm not scared of the extra pawn yet. It's, you know, that's not going anywhere. And I would probably say in slow chess, I wouldn't want to have white because I hate giving up material. But in blitz chess and bullet, I would definitely want white because you start attacking. And if you want a guy to defend perfectly, should have more than 2 or 3 minutes. So it's easier to attack than I think defend this position.
Mr. Feingold?
That's me.
I just had a really maybe an arguably stupid question, but just because I don't know the French too well. But I know the light square bishop for Black is usually, it's kind of hard to place exactly where to put that bishop for it to activate. Are there any variations where that light square bishop can Feingold to b7, or is that not really a thing?
Okay, so for the people in the live audience, he said, this bishop is not very good. And is there any options in the French to play like b6, bishop b7? Which, by the way, still isn't very good. In this variation, that would be very rare. Generally, you would want to move your knight off of d7, maybe to c5, and then play bishop to d7, where the bishop's fine. It's not an open diagonal. And in a lot of positions where white puts his pawns here, like in this variation and the advanced variation, one of Black's ideas is to play bishop d7, bishop b5, and trade off those bishops. And in fact, when I was 14 or 15, I was at the World Open, and I saw a move I never saw before from Grandmaster Anatoly Lane. And it reminded me that Anatoly Lane, the Grandmaster, RIP, he played a match a long time ago with Gary Lane, the IM from England who now lives in Australia. And construction workers showed up because Anatoly Lane was much stronger. And they put a sign, uneven lanes. All right. So after e5, everybody on Earth plays c5. This is the advanced variation. And I saw Anatoly Lane in the World Open play a6, confusing the audience. His opponent made a move, I don't know which one, let's pretend there. Then he played there. His opponent made a move, I don't know which one, and then he played there. Problem solved. I've never seen anybody do that, but Lane did it and he won. I mean, so that's what he does, I guess, because he didn't think about it. That's what he played. Now, there's another line in the advanced French for Black where you also try to do the same thing, which is in this position, you play knight e7. And the idea isn't to go here, which is normal. The idea is to go here with the usual pressure, and you're going to use this knight to play b6, bishop a6, and trade off your bad bishop. So, for example, just as an example, all right, and then bishop a6.
I played this.
Yeah. Right. This is a Spencer favorite. Then we're going to trade the bishops off. This bishop is stuck behind all these pawns. This bishop has a nice square. And then, Black's going to attack the center. And by trading the white squared bishops, it makes it much more difficult for white to get an attack on the king side, because that's a pretty good bishop for that reason. Now, in 1984, when I was in the Soviet Union, and there's a picture, where the coffee machine is? Yeah. The Grandmaster said, look at the center pawns. That tells you whether your bishop is good or bad. Since all these pawns are on dark squares, that's the good bishop because it's not being hindered. And as your question pointed out, the worst question ever. No, great question. The bishop here, isn't very good. That's one of the negatives of the French defense. But one of the negatives for white is in the advance or the variations we're looking at, d4 is sort of weak, because it can't be defended by the e-pawn. The e-pawn moved too far away. So the answer is sometimes you can trade off your white square bishop or even Feingold it. And in fact, a move I wasn't going to talk about, but in the 1986 US Open, in round 1 in Somerset, New Jersey, there was a game between Gary Kitts, who's a 2000 player from Michigan, versus Boris Gulko, who who had just come to the US. He was a refusenik and a defector and so forth. The only person ever to win the Soviet championship and the US championship. He won the US championship 3 times. And he played the move B6 here, which I've never seen before or since. And he won in like 19 moves because he's 2650 and the other guy was like 2000. So, but yeah, he was trying to solve his bishop problem right away. That move makes no sense to me, but all right. I mean, he did well. Now, a variation I like to play, which isn't necessarily related to the Tarrasch, but if you have white, you can't avoid it. So is I take this, which could also happen after knight c3. That way I kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and I get kicked out of all the vegan societies, because you shouldn't do that. And then I play bishop to d7 with the idea of bishop c6. And of course, this is called the Fort Knox. And I've played it many times. And when I played in tournaments, I reserve it for high-rated opponents. I don't want to get a boring position against the 2000. And all the games were totally insane, and they were all draws. What am I, Geary? So sometimes black gets concerned about his bishop, and sometimes he doesn't. It depends what kind of person you are. Okay. So now, the reason we started all this, I was going to say that white's in zugzwang, which isn't true, but the idea is if white plays e5, often white wants to play f4, and then he bolsters his center, c3 and knight f3, another knight, and then the center is just a lock. So there's a lot of weird moves here that don't do anything that have been played by super GMs, such as a6, h6, played by Nigel. He's played a6 too. And the most popular of the weird moves, bishop e7. It develops a piece, and it says, okay, what are you going to do? Now, the most common, obvious move is knight f3. Now you play knight f6, and there's no more f4 ever. And some people don't want to play f4, so it doesn't matter. But some people with black don't want to face f4, so they just learn this line. And if you play e5 right away, and now this knight looks stupid, we actually have an advanced French where both sides have played a weird move. Knight d2 is pretty strange. With the knight here, you play c3 usually. And now I could play c5, knight c6, queen b6, and that's not the best square for the knight. And sometimes this knight can go to f5. So e5 isn't a popular move here. Not at all. And after bishop e7, I think this is actually where I stopped. But there's a game with bishop e7 we're going to look at if we have time. And a6, the idea is now you play c5, and a6 actually prevents bishop b5 later, which is very common in this variation. And after it takes, everybody takes with a pawn. And actually, I've had a similar position in a Sicilian when I've once or twice, not too often, I've played the O'Kelly variation. But I mean, I lived in Belgium, so I have a good excuse. And one of the variations is this. And then you could try to play a French. And if they take, it's pretty similar. And I had this position, and I drew with Priyadarshyan, I think. Yeah. A lot of times openings transpose into each other. It happens all the time. In fact, if they play the c3 Sicilian and you play this, I mean, they can play e5 here, and that's just an advanced French. Happens sometimes. Okay. But that's slightly off topic because we're talking about knight d2. Okay. So c5 is very common. Knight f6 is very common. Probably bishop e7 is third. Knight c6 is fourth. And this is fifth. You're probably not going to face h6 because h6 is pretty silly. Also, you have to know taking on e4. But when I say you have to know it, you're not going to have any problems. You're going to take with a knight and develop your pieces. And white's better because this pawn's blocking the bishop. I have a pawn on the 4th rank. My knight's in a nice square. So that's not scary. Sort of like in a Caro-Kann, when they trade on e4, now they play bishop f5, which you can't play here when the pawn's on c6 and the other pawn's on e7. Okay, now, what you need to do to get better at chess, since this lecture is not going to do it for you, and there was a Belgian FIDE master you've never heard of called Richard Melders. Richard Melders is not a professional chess player because he's an FM. And he teaches, I mean, this is 30 years ago, this information. So he could be a master spy now. I don't know. But he teaches English at a vocational school and in Belgium. He says, first class, I always say the same thing. If you want to learn English, you're not going to do it in my class. And before he could complete what he said, I made like 7 jokes. Like, yeah, not from you. He said, if you want to learn English, go to England or the USA. You ain't going to learn it in my class. Okay, he's correct. If you knew him, you know why he's correct. Okay, so if you want to learn openings, what I do, which is cheating, but you should do it anyway, is you should find the variations that speak to you and find out which GMs play them every single game. And then you're like, all right, Korchnой's better than me. He's played this line 800 times. I'm going to see how he plays it. You go to a database, type in Korchnoj French, and emulate what he does. And a lot of Americans were playing the French a while ago, like Varakobian, Yuri Shulman, etc., mainly etc. And if you just, they're studying openings all day and all night, and you guys are, sleeping and doing illegal activities, right? And those guys are studying. Also, they're doing illegal activities, but they're studying while they're doing it. And why are you studying variation after variation when GMs have already done that and they know what they're going to do? Now, obviously, if they lose every game in 20 moves, you might want to find another GM, okay? So that's a good thing to do. And if you have a database and you just look up games in the French, you'll notice the same people are white and black a lot. And then you're like, all right, that guy's black. He scores 70%. Let's play like him. And against knight d2, if you can't decide whether you want to play knight f6 or c5 or knight here, then you can find your favorite grandmaster and see what they do and see if you like it and see how their results are. And that's how we get better at chess. We stand on the shoulders of giants. That's also how the light bulbs were put in at this place, right? You see these light bulbs, Ovi? Yeah. There's a million of them. I put them all in before we opened. I had to take out the horrible ones. Man, they were not good. Ask Karen. Not good. They were yellow and green and blue and horrible and not working. None of these has ever not worked. It's been 3.5 years. Most of the last 9 or 10 years. What happened? What happened? It just stopped working? No. What's the last 10 years? Okay, I blame society. Okay, now, these games are all shallow and pedantic. I have a couple games I want to look at. White won one of them, and black won another one. Before I start showing you the games, though, I have a funny story. In my research for this, what's this called? A lecture, a class? I looked at many dozens of games. One of the games was not Judah Polgar. It was somebody versus Kramnik. And Kramnik played the French, and I was like, what? Kramnik plays the French. I forgot who his opponent was. It wasn't Judah. Oh, it was Ifan. Yeah, that's who his opponent was. Yeah, and he's getting crushed. He's done a piece in the ending for like a pawn. He's dead lost, and he won. He won on the board. I didn't understand what was going on at the end of the game. Now, the reason I told you that story, number one, I like stories. Number two, you can learn all the openings you want, and then when the opening's done, if you hang your queen every move, you better buy a set that has a lot of queens. You got to play well after the opening. So understanding the ideas, right. Now, I'm very sad that Kasparov is so much worse than he used to be, and it's not because I'm like a Kasparov fan. It's because I do chess, and I see a guy who's the greatest player ever, and then I see what happened to him. And now when he plays at a super GM like Rapid event, You know, he's trying not to come in like the bottom two. When he was in his prime, he was trying to win tournaments by 4 points. Okay, and I could just show you game after game when Kasparov was good, where you'd be like, wow, what's happening? And now if you see games now, you put your head down. It's ridiculous. Okay, so this game was played against a 2365 FIDE, and if I'm correct, this guy plays for the Faroe Islands, which not a lot of chess in the Faroe Islands, not a lot. Okay, a lot of fish. Now, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, why is Kasparov playing Rufus and Doofus? And the answer is it was a simul. So he plays FIDE Masters and IMs and GMs was giving a simul. So remember, White was giving a simul. Remember that. Okay. So they got French defense, knight d2, because that's what the man paid for, knight d2. Okay, c5. Now, you can take on d5, or you can play knight gf3. Kasparov always plays knight gf3. One of my worst losses ever was in 1988 in February against Patrick Wolf. He played knight gf3, and I played the French a lot as black. Ugh. I didn't play well. If you find that game on the internet, which you can, you'll be like, man, Ben, you ain't no good. Yeah, I just got whatever. I didn't lose as badly as this guy. Okay, I'm kidding. It's probably worse. Okay, knight f6. I didn't play that. I think I took on d4. Yeah, Kasparov likes to play super aggressive. Okay, so we've transposed into lines that could happen after knight f6. So the lines could transpose because people are making the same kind of moves. Okay, and this guy played f6 instead of trying to win the pawn on d4, as previously discussed. And, I mean, the guy has a good excuse. It's 2001, so he never play f6. And Kasparov obviously was trying to get a space advantage for the obvious reason that his favorite movie is 2001, A Space Advantage. Yeah. Okay. I mean, Kasparov's English isn't great, so he might have misheard the title. Okay, take, castle, bishop d6. And as the gentleman before asked, what about my bishop? Sorry, you know. Kasparov's like, haha, your bishop's bad. And his opponent said, no talking. So, okay, rook e1, the rook's better on e1. And when I say the rook's better on e1, put your seatbelt on. Castles, bishop h7 check. That's what Ovi would have played. Ovi was like, why did you do that? I was going to suggest that. Remember, Kasparov's giving a simul. Did you remember that? Yeah. And after here, Ovi's like, the obvious reason is, you guys can answer if you want. Karen can answer. Remember, unmute yourself and then answer. Yeah. Rook takes e6. So if queen takes e6, knight g5 check. Man, Kasparov's always lucky. So you have to look out in the French defense about getting attacked. And that's actually why I stopped playing it. I won a lot of endgames, but even when I won those games, I was like, man, those first 25 moves were rough. I had to defend against everything. And sometimes I didn't. So truth hurts. I remember there was a time in my life, 1988, when I played 50 consecutive USCF rated games without losing. Then I was black in the last round in Ohio against Sergei Kudrin. I played the French and I just got destroyed. Then I started another streak. I played 8 games in a row without winning. So I didn't lose them all, but it felt like it. Okay, so the point is, if the queen moves, the bishop is hanging. And if you play queen f4, defending the bishop, I can move the knight anywhere I want because it's the United States of America here. And then the bishop would attack the queen. And I don't know, you could play knight c4, you could play knight e4, you could play knight f1 because the queen can't move and defend the bishop anyway. Then we have a discovered attack. Okay, so his opponent went rogue because his name is similar to rogue and played bishop h2, confusing the audience. He's like, if I'm going to lose my bishop, I'll get a pawn for it. Now, can anybody tell me, either in the live audience or on the internet, which musical group recommends bishop takes h2? Terrible. Okay, what is this tactic called? He's going to lose his bishop, so he gets something for it. What's that?
Desperado?
There you go. And so what musical group would recommend Desperado? Yeah, the Eagles. Yeah.
Bon Jovi? No, the
Ah, Bon Jovi. Boo. That was John. You're
Did he do a
banned.
cover of it? I think he did a cover.
Bon Jovi did a cover? Boo. Now I'm booing Bon Jovi.
Not. I think I'm confusing it for another song.
I hope so. Terrible. Okay, so Kasparov took because if you take the rook, I still have knight g5 check. Truth hurts. Okay, so now Kasparov is a pawn up, and his technique's pretty good against the low-rated player. Pretty good. Man, he still has knight g5 check. He's so mean. He still has knight g5 check if queen takes. Man, he's a mean guy. Okay, he retreated, and you might be like, why did he retreat to e1? And it's answered the next move. Good question. After takes, his rook defends his queen. Okay. And they trade everything, and Kasparov's a pawn up. And you might think, well, I don't know if I would win a pawn up. And Kasparov checkmates his opponent. He's like, I'm pawn up, so I'm going to mate you. Yeah. He made so many good moves this game, but I'll show you my favorite coming up. Yeah, here. No, not f3. Terrible. Yeah, rook e5, because I love collinear moves. Moving his rook towards the rook without capturing it. I love those. Then he remaneuvers his pieces. Yeah, he's always improving. Yeah. Scottish Demon Goat likes black, because black played b6. Yeah. And now d4, because you should always play tactically against Kasparov, except for one thing. Don't play tactically against Kasparov. And it's impossible to understand how good he was tactically unless you saw it. And then if you saw it, you would go into a corner and ball yourself up and cry. Okay, because that happened. I saw him analyze a few times. Yeah. The only difference between Kasparov and an engine is Kasparov sees more. Okay, so watch this Kasparov analysis in this position in a simul. He takes, rook e7 check, giving away his f-pawn. Knight d5 check, only legal move is king g5. f4, you can't take it because the knight's attacking the check, and then mate. And Kasparov has his choice of mates. Rook h7 mate. Yeah. Yeah, not good to play tactically against Kasparov. Not good. There's good and there's not good. So that was an example of white getting a crushing attack with standard kind of attacking moves. Bishop takes h7 check. Rook takes e6 was brilliant. And then when he was a pawn up, he won like it was nothing. Like a big piece of butter. I mean, okay. And last but not least, because black has to win too. Otherwise, something. This is Straplinsky versus Nakamura. And the reason I like this game is because I was there. And possibly I was doing commentary, but I think I was playing in the event. I don't think I was doing commentary. I think I was playing. This game was amazing because it was so weird. And the other reason it's amazing is because Naka played the Guillemard, which I've never seen him play. And that's what I played when I was a kid. Okay, and I've had this position with black. Knight b3 is a move, so the bishop on c1 can get out. And I've played, in fact, I showed a game yesterday on my stream that went this way. My opponent moved his bishop. I played a4, knight c1. Yeah. Straplinsky stopped a4. Knight a7, the bishop retreats. He wants to play c5, threatening c4. And black has good play now. And very strange thing happened this game, which I don't think I've ever seen, ever. In this position, he played c4, which is explosive. Naka played bishop back, and then moved his knight, and Straplinsky lets his bishop on b5, so that bishop was on b5 the rest of the game. There's chat. All right. Yeah. So it's very strange to put your bishop there and trap your own bishop. So he tried to do stuff, but trying is the first step to failure. And watch this defense of the king's side, because Straplinski is going to move some pieces over here and, try to attack. Rook G8, Rook F8. Funny defense of his king. Yeah, and Naka's just saying, I'm going to win eventually because you're down a piece. Okay? And the position is just very weird. And when it's very weird, advantage Naka. He likes when it's really weird. Yeah. G5, typical Carol Khan, French defense device. Yeah, very funny game because the bishop on B5 never does anything. Always retreat. And I like the way Straplinski moves his king to the queen side. That's sort of funny. Yeah. And Naka plays F5 because if you take on Passant, the bishop on G3 is not defended. So Naka's gaining space on the king's side, and he has a pass pawn on D4, and this bishop is trapped. So eventually, Straplinski decided this isn't good because eventually Naka's going to put all his pieces on the king's side, break through, and I'm down a piece. So Straplinski, being very high rated, messed the position up. Other bishop is bad too. And he sacrificed a piece. Okay, and the reason I'm showing you this game, the opening is crazy, the middle game is crazy, the end game is the craziest. And I was watching the game after my game, and we didn't know what was going to happen. We're like, I don't know, the whole world will explode. He stops Rook D7. He finally gets his bishop out, but he's down a piece. Then he sacrifices more material. So now white's down a rook, but black's pieces on the king's side look weird. Finally gets his bishop out, always sack the exchange. He can't play rook E4 because it's hanging, but he can play rook D4. Right. So we're watching the game live and we're like, I don't know, white has 1,000 passed pawns. I don't know. Maybe he's okay. Yeah, rook F5 was the best move. All right, so everybody's queening all their pawns. And here, Straplinski went crazy like Fox News. Always sack the exchange. Bam, double question mark, losing the game. And if he doesn't sack the exchange, the engine says it's equal. Should be a draw. Right. Now, if you want to be more confused, I'm going to say something and you're going to get in shock. Do you have like a Medi? All the pawns are passed. It's a lot of passed pawns. Yeah. Now, I'm going to give you a chess lesson, even though I promised I would never do that. Okay. Lower rated players like passed pawns. They want to have 800 pawns for a queen, 900 pawns for a rook, 700 pawns for a bishop. They love pawns. Grandmasters like pieces. Okay. Now in a blitz game or a bullet game, maybe the pawns will win because it's too hard. In a slow game, even if it's losing, grandmasters want the rook. It's, I have a rook and you don't. They like that. Okay. And if you don't calculate it all, those pawns can queen for white. But unfortunately for Straplinski, Nakamura can calculate. It still looks pretty scary. Yeah, shattered and sundered. Pass pawn to the right of him. Pass pawn to the left of him. He that had fought so well. A7, G7. Very confusing. Now, the rook can't take either pawn because the other pawn queens. The king can't go to B7 because, E6, E7. Okay, so Naka decided to take the E pawn. Bam! More pass pawns than atoms in the universe. 3 pawns on the 7th rank, no good. King c6, and here he resigned because if he goes here and here, and the king goes here, this pawn queens. So that's the end of that. If you try to stay on this pawn, for example, here's a funny variation, which I'm making up as I'm showing you. Okay, what's the winning move for black? Yeah, now you win both pawns. And in a surprise to everybody, I was surprised. Nakamura does know how to mate with a rook. Yeah. So that was a totally insane game where I think both sides were doing okay at different points. And if you have the black pieces and you want an interesting game with winning chances, and you're not trying to get an equal position, you're trying to get an unbalanced position, French defense is pretty good. Because a lot of times white overpresses. But if you don't like having no space, sometimes you get squished in the French. The guy gets his pawn on e5, you can't move anything. you try to open the knob, but there's too much blood on the handle. You know, man, if you guys get that Simpsons reference, you guys are better than I thought. Of course, it's very important to play well in the middle game and end game. But if you're going to win the French defense with either color, you should have pet lines that you like. It doesn't matter if other people like them, and learn them really well. And learn what the ideas are. And sometimes you can just play over 10 or 20 Grandmaster games in your line, and you'll see the same moves a lot. Black's always doing this, white's always doing this. And then you'll have an idea of what's good. And of course, you have to remember, your bishop on c8 can be weak, but a lot of times the pawn on d4 for white is getting attacked a lot because it's hard to defend with this pawn on e4, e5. So both sides have advantages, and I played the French for a long time. I got tired of it, but I play it sometimes in blitz chess now. And occasionally I'll play the Fort Knox, and then I realize the hard knocks of life. C'est pas facile. Any questions from the live audience or the audience at home?
How do you avoid it?
Don't play e4. Avoided. Wow. And if you want to play a pet line against the French, yeah. Okay, you could do some weird stuff here. You could play b3, bishop b2. You could play d3, knight d2, and fianchetto your king bishop. Some GMs were playing f4, like Straplinski and Nakamura. Okay, you could play your own nonsense. And people who hate facing the French, right, but they play e4. The obvious solution is just to trade. Because now you're not really playing a French. You have a symmetrical position, and it's your turn. So you should be happier with white than black, because it's the same position, but it's your turn. I mean, it's equal, but I'd rather have white because it's my move. But yeah, I mean, yeah, if you can't play the French if you don't let them, right? D4, knight f3. Truth hurts. And there's another weird line that white can play like this, but it doesn't have a great reputation. I mean, it's weird not to play d4 when you could play d4. D4. You played e4 to play d4. You play e4 to play king e2, unless you're one of the top players in the world. Then maybe. Maybe if you're like a Carter or a Magnus, maybe that was the idea. And that's the one good thing about e6 is it avoids the bong cloud. So that's good. Yeah. By the way, I was thinking something in my sleep last night that's not related to the lecture, but you'll never stop laughing. Okay? A lot of these bong cloud people at the top level, when they're just kidding and they're just playing a draw, right? Okay. So here's what I would do. Okay. Now you have to remember this position has only occurred once, not twice, because neither side can castle, and they both could castle the first time. This isn't the same position. Okay. Now this is the same position, right? Okay. So what I would do is I would play here and hope my opponent pre-moved king e7. and then you checkmate him. Yeah. Because if you play king e2, king e, you can just keep doing it, and then you mate him. So if Magnus was black against Hikaru could have won in like a few moves. Terrible. Yeah. That's the latest theory. That'll be our next lecture, except for one thing. That won't be our next lecture. Want to thank Olivier Bousquet for his generous, sponsorship of the lecture. Next week's lecture, also suggested by him and sponsored by him, is on the King's Indian. Okay, I'll do the whole King's Indian in an hour. It'll be amazing. You'll be the best player who ever lived, or something like that.
I have a question, Ben.
I have an answer.
If Hikaru had done that,
Right?
would Magnus have cared? And would he have literally
you
not
mean
cared, or
literally?
would he have literally cared?
I think they both would have been laughing a lot. That's what I think. Yeah. Yeah, he would have said that Queen H5 is a decent try. Try to mate me. Yeah. See, I was thinking if I was playing Magnus and somehow he wanted to draw, that if I play Queen H5 and he played King E7, I would play Queen D1 and be a hero instead of mating him. Then I'd be a hero. Queen takes E5, people will get mad at me. But Queen D1, they'd be like, wow, he didn't even mate Magnus when he could. What a hero. All right, see you guys next week. Same information, Zoom and all that. The more you pay, the more you learn. So I guess in this particular lecture, Karen didn't learn too much, but Olivier Bousquet learned a lot. So thanks, Olivier, and I'll see you guys next time. If you're watching at home, like and subscribe, and follow my streams and Karen's streams on our page and our other page, and do as I say. Roar. Bye, everyone.